morning of the 11th of November, 1944, Chairman Joseph Rathenau finally emerged from his new central office. To the east, the Border Watch reported significant Russian military buildup. To the west, the Volkish Red Army was being rushed onto ships for immediate departure to Europe. Trade agreements were scrapped as the economy convulsed. Countries around the world were dissolving their ties with the Volksreich, all without a word spoken between them. It was against this dire backdrop that the chairman organized a grand event in front of St. Reiner's Cathedral and ordered the prize of the Great War, Kaiser Erhard VIII, to be summoned from his small cell. A windy, overcast morning greeted the crowds of thousands, standing in chilly silence as the 900-year-old bones of Pope Leo IV rattled in their cage. They stood there for an hour, and the crowd grew larger as officers of the Arbeiterkorps darted in and out of the magnificent church behind the sturdy platform that Rathenau found himself standing on. Wearing the long leather coat and sharp hat of an Arbeiterkorps officer, his icy gaze stared into the heart of every man who came to listen. What chatter there was suddenly and abruptly fell silent as he raised his arm, bent it at the elbow, and made a fist. At this signal, huge banners unfurled from the church, bearing the silver star and scarlet symbol of Stimme. A gasp rippled throughout the crowd as they saw the spectacle. They went silent again as he began to speak. Sacrifice, proletariat. Do you think you know sacrifice? Understand it? If you think the birthing pains of a new world are not worth sacrificing for, then you do not understand it. Under the final Kaiser, and even further back afield, we faced evils which required the highest of sacrifice, a tribute of blood, of status, of hopes, and of dreams. But in the footsteps of those martyrs of the revolution, on the tops of those headstones, we have arrived at our present world. We defeated the ancient aristocracy, and we challenged the Aquitanian vipers in their den, and their sacrifice was thusly validated. But, Kameraden, today I stand here and ask you to render sacrifice once again. Beyond our borders, the engines of capitalism have already roared to life, and they are aligning themselves against the revolution as we speak. Look out at the horizon, see the black smoke billowing from the foreign factories. Those factories forge your chains. They are pounding out the irons which will clasp your wrists, and etching your names onto brands for your flesh. The barons and speculators and fat bourgeois classes are assembling their mercenary horde, the nations of the world one and all ingratiated in their dreadful economics. The foot soldiers of perdition march from the Urals, from the North Sea, from Africa, from North America, from the Mediterranean. All come to grind our cities to dust and condemn your children and your children's children to toil and injustice that will drive them into shallow graves. So, I ask you for sacrifice. I call upon you to sacrifice your time, your blood, your sweat, your doubts, your God, your superstitions, and even your way of life. I ask you to boldly sacrifice to the visage of total war. For it is only through this titan, born through the will of our collective suffering, can the Volksreich overcome the dragon that is eyeing our throats. So, brothers, sisters, revolutionaries all, let the fires of our fury burn as one, and only when the blood beats in flowing streams from the bodies of the capitalists, then we shall know that we have won, that the revolution is secure, and that the end of history has been achieved. But until then, fight, claw, rip, and tear. Become the monster you never thought you could become. Join me, lose yourself in the revolution, and find yourself reborn. At that moment, Kaiser Erhard VIII was dragged onto the stage, and the bag was taken off of his head. Chairman Rathenau shot him in his lower spine, as officers of the Arbeiterkorps tossed him into the crowd, crippled. They tore him apart, tens of thousands of hands shattering his bones with blows, tearing his hair out at the roots, cutting open his hands and his legs, and in a matter of minutes there was nothing left of him. The flags that concealed the church suddenly fell away, and the intricately carved and laboriously beautified Cathedral of St. Reiner the Zealot, a work of generations, was seen for the last time, as pops were heard from deep within the structure, and flames bellowed forth, bursting the windows, sending black smoke into the sky like the prayers of the saints. Clergy that tried to flee were tossed back in the burning building. The crowd watched in astonishment, and while many were silent, these zealous Rathenites were loud enough and numerous enough to whip the crowd into a frenzy, the heat and ashes landing on their faces like an infernal snow. The immense church burned for 3 days, during which time Chairman Rathenau passed a myriad of reforms. First, the economy was overhauled, entirely remade for the purpose of pursuing total war. Military service also became mandatory for all men ages 16 to 30. Leonists, or those suspected of having supported the former Chairman Beck, were purged from military, government, and academia, given show trials, and summarily executed, replaced with loyalists. The collectivization of farms was further reinforced by divorcing people from land they saw as theirs, shuffling resistant or underperforming farmers from one end of the country to the next until they became productive. Thematic as to his so-called anti-sermon, all religious belief was outlawed, and all churches were to be destroyed, replaced with a secular building for the public good, like libraries, gymnasiums, or schools. The Nova Volkish Covenant Albigensian Church was dissolved and replaced with the Volkish Academy for Philosophy and Rathenite Thought. Those who were revealed to be harboring illegal beliefs were to be killed. A list of banned books and art was produced to ensure ideological purity, including the Bible and historical artifacts with religious or anti-authority undertones. The Central Committee was shrunk, and its powers expanded, mandating things like family size, ration distribution, and which children were deemed fit for higher education. The Hellman Jugend was expressly reworked into a pre-military training camp, preparing soldiers for war once they turned 16. The Arbeiterkorps was reimagined into a sprawling secret police force with unlimited powers to counter subversive behavior, allowing them to construct a terrifying panopticon overnight, the suffocating completeness of which no enemy of the state could escape. Volkish society and its many reforms became a difficult thing to comprehend, but if nothing else was accomplished by this, the people were once again ready for war, rallied to a frothing rage essentially moments after the end of the Great War. On the 15th of November 1944, Tsar Andrei Blatomil of the Russian Empire revealed the dreadful fruit of what had been years of clandestine planning on the part of the monarchical and capitalist nations of the world, the schematics of which were dubbed Operation Unfathomable, and announced the formation of the Communist and Partisan Intelligentsia Termination Associated League, or Capital. Immediately, Russia was formally joined by the Republic of China, the Magyarország, Ireland, Aquitania, Japan, Korea, Al-Kufa, Shabans, Argentina, Colombia, and Iceland. Capital declared war upon the Volksreich that day, which encouraged co-belligerents to do the same, namely Africa, Aksu, Pasai, Ad-Daulas, Mali, and the Fatimids. And so, Chairman Rathenau's paranoias were proven correct in the most dire fashion. The Volksreich's only ally was the Icelandic home island, as controlled by the Free Iskander Army, making them the only two members of their alliance called the Grand Internationale. Thus began the War of Containment, commonly known by the codename that sparked it, Operation Unfathomable. With the Volkish army still on the sea route to the homeland, a combined force of Russian, Magyar, Irish, and African soldiers were able to unilaterally converge on Stettin, striking at the heart of the People's Empire like a bolt of lightning, holding and utilizing the city as a forward base of operations for the further invasion of the Volksreich. However, the Arbeiterkorps was able to halt their advance after the fall of Stettin by way of laying explosive traps and rallying the common people to resist and subvert the occupiers. When more than half of the Volkish Red Army arrived in Europe under Volkskommissar Albrecht Riemensberger, he had no other choice but to pledge his allegiance to Rathenau to avoid consigning the revolution to destruction. From November 20th, 1944 to January 21st, 1945, the nations of Capital were terrified, fearing for their lives that the gamble upon which they had placed the very future of mankind had failed. This period was known as the Red Terror. The Red Terror was characterized by the Volkish Red Army, bolstered by 1 million fresh conscripts, exploding out in every direction, overcoming every obstacle, remaining totally undefeated for nearly 3 months, typically very crucial early months for a major war. On the Eastern Front, the Volkish Red Army cut off occupied Stettin from the capital supply chain and began to push the Russians back. Stettin was pummeled by mortar attacks, artillery strikes, and firebombing runs, which carpeted the city in devastation, yet the occupiers were able to hold their ground for the moment. The Magyars were also being overwhelmed by Volkish might, losing land in the Carpathian Mountains and in southern Italy, complicating their supply chains. The Battle of Székesfehérvár, the Magyar capital, was the defining battle between the two in this conflict. The city had set up ingenious defenses as they got word that the Red Horde was slicing through the frontier, breaking the limiters on their manned anti-air guns and aligning them level with the ground to decimate and terrify Volkish forces, importing dozens more from neighboring cities and doing the same to them. This was based on the known fact that the Volkish Red Army did not often utilize air support, at least not in more than one place at once. When the light tanks came flying over the hill outside the city, they were ripped to shreds, their thick steel cut to ribbons as the soldiers nearby were blinded by tracer rounds. The noise, of course, was deafening. The very foundations of the city were shaken. But when every armored vehicle was undone, turned to foil, the infantry still came rushing over that hill, and even as it was turned into a mountain of sand and chum, they kept climbing, rushing, fighting, struggling onwards towards that city with the determination more than even that of an animal, more like a great rushing mass of water, inhuman, inevitable. Magyar soldiers had to switch out, as many of them grew ill, breaking down, killing that many people at once. Disgust and shame were replaced by terror when 1, then 10, then dozens of men overcame the defenders, breaching the range of their AA cannons and approaching the city, covered head to toe in blood and crazed with ideological fury. Eventually, the defenders were all killed, and the commandeering of the city itself started, using it as a southern base of operations, much like Stettin was for capital in the north. The Volksreich sent whatever ships it had to choke the Irish Channel between it and Normandy to prevent a naval invasion, in many cases sending ships laden with oil and explosives full speed for their beaches, docks, and coasts in general, lighting up the islands for miles all around, which served a double purpose, lighting the way for the crude Volkish bombers dropping massive payloads on cities like London, Birmingham, and Cardiff. Smaller planes dropped demoralizing propaganda as well, including pamphlets that read, "The men that send you to fight abuse your wives and children at home. Rise up and end this useless war. Workers of Ireland, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Finally, and most significantly, the Southern Front was wildly successful, managing to occupy nearly all of North Africa, denying capital use of the Mediterranean Sea, and putting Afriki on the back foot, their capital now surrounded by communist hostility. The Volkish Red Army did not try to take more than what was found along the coast, fortifying it and intending to use it as a lure to draw away other resources from other theaters in the war, which worked magnificently, as the Irish and Afrikaans worked in tandem, but not together, pitting all their colonial might against the Volkish threat in the Maghreb. The Yusufids grew rich off the North African conflict especially. Meanwhile, the Red Terror manifested in the Americas by way of the Volksreich conquering the Midwest and Great Plains in their entirety, as well as linking Volkish South American holdings with the North American ones. The Irish were not able to allocate resources to an invasion through Irish South America, but their defense of Irish Florida was valiant. The Volksreich soon thereafter occupied Icelandic holdings in Canada, and even pushed the Chinese further past the Rockies and up against the west coast. It truly seemed as though Operation Unfathomable had failed. That was until a chain reaction occurred, beginning deep in the supply lines of the Volkish command economy, a delicate and intricate machine that could not handle this kind of malfunction. It began on January 11, 1945, when several of the collective farms, specifically the ones which were also responsible for grain processing and in some cases meat or dairy farming, over-reported to government officials the quantity of harvest to be sent off to the front, unable to rise to the standards set by the government, wishing to avoid a visit from the Arbeiterkorps. When these insufficient, padded, or otherwise unacceptable shipments of food reached the Central Distribution Office, they asked the Central Committee for guidance. They prioritized the front and ordered that the food be sent to them first, cutting the people's rations according to region, in some cases by more than half to compensate. One of the hardest hit regions was the steel foundry region south of Alençon. One of the workers, distracted and hungry, accidentally tipped the steel cauldron, burning the factory to the ground. This led to a slightly insufficient steel yield in that area, but wanting to meet quotas regardless, other industries like armored vehicles or firearms production introduced subpar metals in order to make whatever they could. Many of these weapons would fail on the front lines and in some cases kill their users. The industry was reformed, and professionals from ammunition factories were relocated to amend the shortcomings in the firearm production factories. Soon enough, the firearms outnumbered the ammunition needed for them, and in many cases soldiers were sent with only a handful of bullets with which to defend himself, some being sent with empty rifles being told to use their bayonets. This severely affected the morale on the front, but more importantly, the effectiveness of the Volkish Red Army. Other materials began to experience problems of this sort as well, namely in complicated material industries like rubber, silk, or tungsten. Chairman Rathenau ordered all those responsible to be punished, and a purge of the industrial coordinators was conducted, leading to more problems stemming from a lack of experience, and as such the tide began to turn against the Volksreich. On almost all fronts, the Volkish Red Army was defeated due to the supply chain comedy of errors. They universally choked the Volksreich from every direction, almost a perfect circle constricting the people's empire. By the time they were able to correct this error, the Irish landed in Spain and pushed up to the Pyrenees, the Russians advanced all the way to Stettin, the Magyarország reclaimed the Balkans, Iceland reclaimed its land in North America and defeated the Free Islander army, reclaiming their home island. In America, the Chinese began to mount a terrifying effort in North America, though here the Volkish Red Army held. The mountain combat here was of the most dastardly sort, the Chinese using what they learned from the Paschemi Dal, and the Volksreich using what they learned from the Aquitanians in the Pyrenees. Colombia was able to push the Volksreich out of South America, however. The other stubborn front was the Maghreb, where the firmly entrenched Volkish forces were still well supplied by commandeered local factories. By October, the European front simply collapsed. Schwarzburg was captured by the Russians, a wholesale retreat was made to North Africa, and the Volkish capital was moved to Albany, which was reinforced in much the same way the Aquitanians had managed to do. After this unmitigated tragedy, the war from January 1945 to November 1947 was a slow, grinding affair, costing millions of lives. The Maghreb was ground down until the Battle of Gibraltar was fought, the defense led by Volkskommissar Riemensberger, and the assault led by a coalition of Irish, Russian, and Magyar troops under the command of Russian General Alister Raphaelovich Croylon, son of Raphael Croylon, the military genius who contested the Aquitanian throne upon the death of his nephew. This battle was academic in its execution, and almost out of place in the modern age, as it felt more like two great heroes coming to blows outside towering Trojan walls in time immemorial. Volkskommissar Riemensberger first cut off the Strait of Hercules, preventing an Irish assault from across the way, and relied upon swift men on Arabian horses, often locals, sent out beyond the walls in the dead of night to harass and beleaguer capital forces, while in the morning maintaining Panzerfaust rocketeers to fire upon enemy mortar positions and artillery pieces. The men on horses were often called the Zentauren, and made a great show of their raids. The goal of Volkskommissar Riemensberger in this respect was to deny the enemy sleep, or even any rest at all, carefully alternating men to sleep, and men to ride out and harass the enemy, or fire anti-armor weaponry at their positions, eventually baiting them into an assault of Gibraltar, where they would lose their men. General Croylon, meanwhile, bided his time, and coasted on discipline for a long while, counting on the limited supplies of Riemensberger and not taking the bait of an all-out assault. He attempted to obtain air support, but the anti-air capabilities of the defenders offered coverage that was too complete to penetrate. Eventually, when the rocket attack slowed, Croylon employed the use of custom-built gliders to drop makeshift pipe bombs into the city below. This worked just as he'd hoped, as just when they shot them down they exploded and caused great damage, but when they did not, they landed themselves against some place in the city and caused worse damage. One of these gliders hit the main food storage facility in the city, and eventually it was Riemensberger that was lured out into a fight. It seemed glorious, honorable, and terribly outdated, conducted in an almost 18th century manner. The two armies lined up, the two great generals acknowledged each other, and the fighting began. The Zentauren were sent out first with guns and long bayonets, and while they were occupying the main middle mass consisting of heavy gunners, two columns of infantry flanked their position, while one column of armored vehicles protected Gibraltar. General Croylan responded to this by sending his own column of armored vehicles behind the Volkish cavalry, hoping to decimate them. This lured the Volkish armored vehicles away from their quarry, and they left without asking the Volkskommissar, which led to the mutual destruction of the mechanized assets on both sides. Though of course the city then laid woefully unprotected, Croylan hoping that was enough to give his allies across the Mediterranean an opportunity to invade. However, men were still manning the anti-air guns, and the strait was still blocked, so it was up to Croylan. He eventually ordered his men to break rank and feign a retreat, allowing the communists to remain right on their heels. However, as they pursued, they turned on a dime, and ran through the lines of their pursuers, who scarcely had time to react. The Volkish Red Army was startled and confused, and the chase was resumed in the other direction. Eventually, Croylan's men got to the walls and set hundreds of explosives by the base of the walls, while an outer line of the compatriots defended their sabotage. Eventually, a stray Volkish bullet struck their arrangement before they were ready, blowing a hole in the wall and killing most men from either army. They both entered the city and engaged in urban warfare for 3 weeks until Croylan and his men were able to take control of the strait and clear it for Irish invasion. Eventually, the city belonged to them, and Volkskommissar Albrecht Riemensberger was captured and brought before General Alistair Raphaelovich Croylan. When asked if he had any final message for the world, he said that honor is best not burdened with too many words. The revolution is inevitable, and you will fight bravely in it. A shame it'll be for the wrong side. He was then shot in the back of the head by Croylan, who ordered him buried in the proper manner in the surviving ruins of a church. Many thought this was an insult to a communist, but others thought that this was an unusual honor, giving his greatest enemy a burial. With this funeral, the Volksreich was completely ejected from the Old World, and the pernicious forces of capital focused on the theater of North America. During the Battle of Gibraltar, which lasted from late 1946 to 1947, Chairman Rathenau demanded something extraordinary to win the war. He was convinced of the necessity of a superweapon to turn the tides, and in late 1946, Volkish scientists began to work on the so-called Albany Project, which pursued the splitting of the atom to produce an effect great and terrible, which would change the course of humanity forever. On the 29th of June, 1947, just as the bulk of capital forces began to make landfall on the eastern seaboard, the Albany Project was more than halfway done. On the 29th of June, due to Volkish propagandizing, Irish communists gained serious following and began an insurgency by the name of the Irish Republican Army, under the leadership of Kevin McCulloch. On the 4th of September, the first nuclear weapon, dubbed the Kameraden, was ready for testing. On the prairies of the Volkish Midwest, top scientists and political leaders sat for one of the greatest shows Earth had yet seen. When the bomb was dropped from its high-hanging construct, successfully detonating just above the Earth, the grasses for miles in every direction were blown flat, and the ones immediately nearby were vaporized into gas and ash. This was precisely the superweapon that Chairman Rathenau was hoping for, and rumor says that he shed a tear at the sight of it. On the 2nd of January 1948, a paramilitary force called the Komunisti was sparked in the Magyarország under the leadership of a man called Antony Slaviovich, a member of the Arultek Russian minority there. In much the same way as the IRA, they were terrorists. Now, armed with nuclear weapons, the neglected Volkish Air Force needed to secure air superiority in a given area before it could have a means of delivering this new payload to anywhere meaningful. By 1949, Magyar forces secured the Panama Canal from the Volksreich. With all the armies on the same continent, things now went fairly quickly. By 1950, Chinese forces beset Volkish America from two fronts, and their knowledge of mountain combat proved superior, while elsewhere Volkish scientists were 150 days away from perfecting a decent tactical bomber to deliver their new devastating payload. In May, the Chinese split Volkish America in half. On the 21st of July 1950, Albany was placed under unilateral siege by capital forces, and unlike the Battle of Gibraltar, it was not prolonged or heroic. The city was gassed, utilizing all of the chemical weapons capital had on hand, eventually enabling it to fall to Magyar forces specifically. Chairman Rathenau was caught fleeing the city with an entourage of dedicated believers who ran into the forest when he told them to, getting captured himself. He was taken to a gallows erected right outside of the city and was shouting all the while, saying, "History will damn you, and I will be remembered as the highest martyr of the revolution, correct, aligned, and pure. You kill me and I become an idea, a concept, without fault and immortal. I will haunt you, and the doctrine I had borne out will guide humanity into a golden age, with or without you." He only stopped speaking when they executed him by hanging. He did not receive a burial. Meanwhile, panicked Volkish scientists dumped the 2 nuclear weapons they had developed into Lake Michigan, hoping to conceal these doomsday weapons from the world. At the Treaty of North Platte, paid for with 150 million lives, the world butchered the People's Empire. Italy, France, Poland, and Estonia were new states liberated from the Volksreich. Ireland took Iberia, Russia took the Nordic regions, the Magyars took the non-liberated parts of Italy, and Africa got its old borders back. In North America, the Republic of China annexed large parts of the Volkish Midwest. Aquitania annexed the Volkish Islands and Canada, Colombia was allowed to annex part of Central America, and Africa was given its old borders back there as well. The Volksreich was refashioned into a republic ruled in the first election by the Socialist Party, headed by Levi von Blumenthal, who had the unenviable task of rolling back the Rathenite reforms and outlawing Stimme. The Volksreich was forced to demilitarize, the old pre-war flag of the Red Line was reinstated, and the Volksreich was placed within the Capital Alliance. The Volksreich truly a shattered husk of its former glory. Meanwhile, Italy was almost immediately puppeted by the Magyarország. As Chinese soldiers passed through the new Volkish land they got in the Treaty of North Platte, they died in the thousands and doctors were unable to identify their gruesome and sudden cause of death. The specific area was quarantined by Allied forces, as well as Lake Michigan, and forgotten about. The Volksreich would continue to lose relevancy, never regaining its former prominence on the world stage. Though only a handful know of the terrifying power that they almost released upon the world on that cold January morning. This would be the end for any nation, but while the country was reduced to a husk, ideas are much harder to kill. The Rathenites who fled into the woods continued their subversions and machinations as the world went on around them, naming their movement Flustern, which was not an acronym and simply a pun on Stimme. By 1960, capital enveloped the world in a strange confederal mess, setting up a central office of global legislation called the Capital Parliament in the Irish capital of Dublin, and it was through their systems and bureaucratic byways that Flustern, that secret Rathenite element, was able to grow and fester and recruit. As capital proved itself unable to deal with the threats of terrorism, economic recession, environmental concerns, and human rights abuses, Flustern was able to nudge society in a direction concerned with space travel and exploration, beginning in the 1970s, otherwise just redirecting resources to applicable friendly sources. Every now and then a communist would be found out, but Flustern would have to let them take the fall. A major purge of the ranks led by Russian investigators in the 80s almost destroyed the operation, and while capital was able to lift record amounts of people out of poverty, a hole in the ozone layer over the Atlantic Ocean caused by their chemicals and industry was growing. By 2070, ecological concerns had been met by capital, feedback loops avoided by way of advanced carbon capture technology, but Flustern still needed a panic to convince people to organize a launch to explore exoplanets, so botched data and manipulated media outlets to direct the conversation in a direction of panic. By 2086, Flustern was able to get 2 generation ship-style rockets prepared for launch in the Capital Space Agency, called Capital S. Ship 2 was filled with Flustern operatives, having killed anybody else who tried to qualify for Ship 2. And Ship 1, filled with regular astronauts, getting on a sabotaged rocket. When the crowd that gathered saw them pierce the clouds, one soared on into the dark blueness, while the other burst into a golden amber flash, debris peppering the crowds as they screamed in horror. Indeed, Rathenau had haunted the world which left him behind, and his ideas accompanied the future of mankind into the stars. Flustern wanted nothing more than to churn up the heavens, upstaging the natural order and rearranging the constellations, all in the name of the Eternal Revolution.